With the U.S. Meat Export Federation, we are for those that aren't familiar with us, we're a nonprofit based in Denver, Colorado. We represent the export interests of exporting companies large and small around the U.S., including large and small packers, trading companies, and also have a membership which includes many allied industry producers, as well as some of the state and national associations for various commodities around the U.S. With really the goal of just enhancing the value of red meat exports throughout the world. We do that via 18 international offices that are boots on the ground, working on technical issues, working on our market access issues, and also working on marketing activities for many of these companies that are selling beef, pork, and lamb. So to jump right into it, I'm going to talk this afternoon briefly just about kind of where we stand in terms of our red meat exports around the world. Obviously, when it comes to red meat production, domestic market comes first. We export a fraction of our beef and pork production to the foreign markets. And pales in comparison to the tonnage that we do in the United States, but it certainly does have a big impact on the profitability of cattle and hog producers around the United States. And so I'm going to talk first a little bit about competitive analysis, some of our market access issues to follow with that. Currently looking at the landscape of red meat exports, on the beef side, we've got tight global supplies around the world. That's kind of headlined by the United States as well as Australia with their prolonged drought here over the last couple of years and some pretty large-scale herd liquidation, which is drastically decreasing their cattle numbers and their ability to export. The U.S. and Australia being the two largest beef exporters in the world, that has a big impact on the global beef market. And as a function of that, U.S. beef prices are high. They've been record high over the last couple of years, but we've continued to see records in export values, records in export tonnage of beef around the world, and that's really been propped up by an overall global economic expansion and global economic growth. We're getting beef and pork into developing markets like we haven't seen before, and we're seeing the developed markets purchasing more because they like the quality of U.S. beef, and so beef and pork. And so that global economic growth has kind of propped up that ability. Relative to hogs, I've got that colored in yellow there because we have going to have some record hog supplies and pork supplies in 2015. Now, looking at that from a producer standpoint, we're already seeing the effect that has on prices, and those are decreasing for live hogs. At the same time, since we have a wall of pork coming at us and we are seeing relative hog carcass prices decreasing, and I'll show you some charts on that in a moment. It is making us more competitive with our counterparts in the EU and our international markets. And so we don't necessarily, from a producer standpoint, want to see our prices go down in order to sell more pork, but that is an effect that's having is last year pork prices were fairly high. We lost out in some competition to the EU, and we're kind of leveling the playing field coming into 2015. The big key to our ability to export is market access. We see countries like China, we see countries like Russia, two of the biggest consuming markets in the world, that either have restricted or completely blocked our access for beef and pork. For Russia, we have no access for beef and pork at the current time. For China, we have limited pork access because of some growth promoting restrictions they've put on our pork exports, and we have no access for beef. So missing out on two of the biggest exporting markets in the world also has an effect. And currently, just from an economic standpoint, the U.S. dollar is as strong as it's ever been. When we have a strong U.S. dollar, that makes our exports less appealing, and so is kind of having a negative impact on our current ability to export. Running through the numbers very quickly, I've got some outstanding charts that our in-house staff economists put together for me, but I'll try and get through these quickly. In 2014, we set records for our overall value of beef exports at a little over $7 billion. That's up 16% from the previous year. We exported about 1.2 million metric tons of beef overseas. That's up 2% from the previous year. In total, we export about 14% of the volume of our beef production to overseas markets, and that accounts for adding about $300 per every head slaughtered in the United States. We get that value from looking at what the value of a product is going to go overseas versus how we can utilize that in the domestic market. So a good example of that is we sell beef liver in Egypt for about $1.25, $1.30 a pound. We keep that in the domestic market. More often than not, that's going to go into rendering or pet food production at about 25 cents to 30 cents a pound. So adding a dollar per head or $1 per pound just based off of liver value, I could go through a whole list of cuts and really show you the impact of that. But the $300 a head is up about $55 a head over the previous year. So you can really see where we're generating a lot of value in the export markets. Top export markets for beef on a value basis is Japan, number one, and then Hong Kong, Mexico, Canada, and Korea rounding out the top five. Relative to pork exports in 2014, again, record value numbers there at nearly $6.7 billion in pork exports, accounting for nearly 2.2 million metric tons, both up over the previous year. Pork, we do export quite a bit more of our production at a little over 26%, and that adds about $62 per head to every hog slaughtered in the United States. And you can see that the top markets for our pork exports are the same five, just in a little bit different order there on a value basis. So talking about some of these issues, as I mentioned before, you can see here that in 2015, our dollar is as strong as it's ever been relative to those currencies listed at the bottom of that chart. And like I said, as the value of the dollar increases, the appeal of our export products, whether that's red meat or anything else, is diminished. And so that's having somewhat of a negative effect on our ability to move beef and pork internationally at the current time. Specifically to beef, you can see that world production of beef is down fairly substantially from 2014, or what it's predicted to be in 2015 versus 2014. The two headlines on that chart are obviously the U.S. and Australia, and I'll go into Australia's issue on the next slide. We do see beef production increases in Brazil, the EU, India is becoming a big player in the export markets, but those increases in their beef production really haven't been enough to prop up the overall global beef supplies. And so as a function of that, we're seeing increased prices for beef exports from around the world. Specific to Australia, Australia is our biggest competitor in the global beef market, and it's kind of a bleak picture. Meat and Livestock Australia 2015's outlook is that their productive cattle herd, is going to be at a 2-decade low. Beef production, beef exports, beef slaughter are all each going to be down, expected about 11%. Their live cattle exports, which is a huge part of the Australian beef industry, is going to be down 23% just from the overall liquidation of the cow herd. And so they're kind of coming into what we were experiencing 5 or so more years ago when we had prolonged drought in the United States. We were retaining less heifers, we were killing more cows, and we really saw a big spike in the decrease, or a big decrease in the overall cow herd. We're expecting Australia to have that in 2015, and that's going to have the same effect on prices that was what we've seen in the last several years in the U.S. For U.S. beef. And really, I think this chart paints a pretty interesting picture here. That top blue line on the very end, that's the price of U.S. beef carcasses on a dollars per kilo basis versus our major competitors. You get all the way down there in the bottom, you can see Australia, Paraguay, Uruguay, Brazil. They all sit there at a much, much lower value on a per carcass basis. Now, part of that is because they're producing primarily a lower quality grass-fed product. It's not going to be as high value as good, high-quality grain-fed U.S. beef. But you can really see where our discrepancy is here in the global market and the prices that we're trying to charge for high-quality U.S. beef relative to our competitors that, like I said, are providing a lower-quality grass-fed product. But demand is still good. The global economic expansion I talked about, you can see from 2009 to 2014, the world essentially has doubled the value of beef exports globally over that time. You see countries like China, they've now become They've surpassed the U.S. in being the largest importer of beef worldwide. That makes a big impact on the amount of beef that's being purchased in the global market when China starts making moves in that sense. And so over the last few years, with an increase in the global economy, we see a larger taste for beef around the globe. Transitioning to pork a little bit, we can see that the China, the EU, and the U.S. make up a little over 80% of the world's overall pork production. So really, when you talk about it from a competitor basis, it's the United States and the EU. China is really consuming the broad majority of all of the pork that they are producing, even though they are the largest pork producer in the entire world. Looking at our changes in production, we're basically seeing the opposite of what I just explained in beef. Overall world pork production is up. The U.S. is up substantially after they've rebounded from their PEDV issues last year. And then you see the EU is up in production. Several of the other competing countries are up. China is really the only country that we've seen a decrease at all in pork production over the last year. But like I said, that doesn't have nearly as much of an effect on the export markets from a competing standpoint. And as a function of that, it's been a race to the bottom for the competitors, for the major pork producers in terms of price. You can see at the bottom of that chart, you've got Canada, U.S., Chile, EU, Brazil, all seeing large decreases in their overall hog carcass prices. And on the chart here on the bottom right, you can see double-digit percentage decreases in those hog carcass prices from 2014 to 2015. U.S. hog carcass prices decreasing nearly 30%. And from an EU standpoint, really the big mover on this was Russia. And the U.S. has been shut out from the Russian market since the beginning of 2013. Later in 2013, Russia shut out the EU. And so they had about 450,000 metric tons of pork that they had to find someplace to go with. And they opted to start transitioning that pork into Asia, where the U.S. has a really good stronghold in markets like Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, China. And so basically they took all that pork, they started selling lower value frozen pork into the supermarkets in some of those countries, and they started displacing us. Some of that had to do with the West Coast port situation earlier in the year, which I'll talk about in a bit. But anyway, in terms of the Asian markets, where we have a tremendous amount of success with pork exports, EU has become a major player in that simply because they've been diverting supplies on account of Russia. So switching just a little bit from the economics of it, free trade agreements from a policy standpoint are really crucial in the effect that they have on exports. The North American and the Central American free trade agreements were the most meaningful signed in the last couple decades, and they've had big impacts on our exports to our friends to the north and to the south. But currently, the U.S. government is engaged in the Trans-Pacific Partnership Free Trade Agreement negotiations, which includes 12 countries, namely the U.S. and Japan, as well as the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or the TTIP, which is a negotiation between the U.S. and the EU. And why are these so important? It all really boils down to preferential tariff rates and duties. For example, Korea and the U.S. signed a free trade agreement, I believe, in 2012, in which, relative directly to beef and pork, we see decreases annually on our tariff rate for fresh and frozen beef and pork. And that's put us at a competitive advantage, specifically versus Australia. Well, last year, Australia went and signed the Japan-Australia Economic Partnership Agreement, or EPA, which has put them in a similar situation, and now we're at a disadvantage on our exports to Japan versus our biggest competitor, Australia. So that really adds to the urgency of this Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement coming to a close, because we could really use those improvements in the tariff rate schedule moving forward for our competitiveness in our biggest and most important market for beef and pork. So finally, I want to talk about a handful of market access issues, and they are varied, they are wide. We can maybe kind of boil them down into several different baskets, if you will, but you can see that just from a general sense, our market access issues span the globe. and span the spectrum of things that a country can use to control our ability to export to foreign markets. Animal health concerns is probably one of the biggest, especially when you look at our beef exports. We're still feeling the effects from 2003 BSE case. We still have countries which remain completely closed to U.S. beef exports or restrict our product scope that of beef that we can send to those markets. Relative to pork, diseases like PRRS, issues like trichina, there are countries that restrict our pork exports on account of that. And then if you look at a more global standpoint, countries will close markets because of foot and mouth disease presence, African swine fever presence, and as any of our friends in the poultry business in this room are seeing, the high path avian influenza is having a huge effect on our international markets at the current time. The U.S. does have an extremely robust animal disease control system. We're very highly regarded by the World Organization for Animal Health, or the OIE. U.S. does have negligible BSE risk, which should put us in a position where we shouldn't have these market access restrictions. But some countries still have that concern, and they remain in place today. And it really brings to question the importance of traceability. Now, just looking at this from a pure competition standpoint, and I'm going to point out China in particular with our current negotiations trying to get beef access into that country. One of the biggest sticking point right now in the China beef negotiations is that they want full traceability from a slaughter plant back to the birth farm. And Brazil, Canada, Australia, Mexico's in the process. They have all agreed to this for the Chinese so they can get into that market. And the U.S. doesn't currently have a national traceability system which is to the liking of the Chinese, whether it be voluntary or whether it be mandatory. So that's just something that looms over us. I'm not advocating for it one way or another, but it's an issue that sits out there. And in the case that we were to ever get an FMD case, an African swine fever case, then traceability could be something that's key to regain that market access. But luckily we have the disease controls in place in the United States that I think we're in a good position in the here and now. So just a quick example of that. These are the markets that continue to be closed to U.S. beef after the 2003 BSE case. Most notably, China, the largest importing country in the world, and the U.S. does not have access to that market. But on top of that, some of our biggest markets like South Korea, Japan, Taiwan, we're still limited in our product scope that we can only export beef that is from cattle under 30 months of age to those markets. Several of the largest beef consuming markets in the world, and we can only export a percentage of our total annual production. And what's the effect on that? Is market displacement. In 2003, in Japan and Korea, we had well over the majority market share in both of those countries for our beef exports. Those markets closed immediately after the 2003 BSE case, and when we got back into the market, which is I think around 2006-ish, by 2008, we had less than 15% market share, and in red there, Australia had well taken over with the majority of beef exports to those countries. We've scratched and clawed our way back over the last 11 years to where we're nearly at 40% market share for those markets, but they have an appetite for U.S. beef, and it's certainly important for us to get back in a position of being the majority stakeholder in those markets. Other market access issues, hormones, beta agonists are two of the top line that continue to restrict our access to countries. The EU has a well-documented history with their averseness towards growth-promoting technologies. We went through a WTO case on that in the 80s and 90s. But Russia and China, the Russia market closed in 2013 because of ractopamine residues in pork and beef. China continues to maintain that if we export pork, and if we are ever going to export beef, that it's going to have to be free of ractopamine, or free of beta agonist residues. And they've also placed restrictions on Australian beef exports on account of hormones, both Russia and China. So those are dynamics that we have to keep an eye on and have an effect, like I said, on our ability to export. And really it comes down to fundamental ideology. Many countries accept the Codex MRLs that are established by an international standard-setting body. That's great. Some countries accept the FDA process, and they recognize the U.S. as an authoritative standard-setting group, and they accept the standards that we've put on them on veterinary drugs, even when they differ from the Codex. But then you also have countries who exercise the precautionary principle. They think that these residues have to be zero rather than having a tolerance established. And when that happens, considering the majority of the beef produced in our country contains, or the cattle have received a hormone implant that really affects our ability to export. And then the last one I wanted to note on here that some of you may not be as familiar with is PRTs, or pathogen reduction treatments. These are food safety interventions that are utilized by the processing facilities to kill pathogens on the exterior of carcasses as they're being applied. It's a common sense food safety precaution that we're trying to make food safer. There's countries that have an averseness to these, specifically the EU, most recently Singapore. They see the U.S. What they say is the U.S. is spraying chemicals on the carcass so they can cover up bad hygienic slaughtering practices. And so as a function of that, we can't utilize these important food safety measures to provide a safe product to these countries. And in Japan, it's a regulatory issue where they just classify them differently than the USDA and FDA. So again, just another market access hurdle. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because it's an issue that's kind of somewhat come and passed. Earlier, I guess late in 2014, early in 2015, the Longshoremen's Union on the West Coast was on strike, and we had a big issue on our West Coast ports. Containers were piling up. They were sitting in the port for 1, 2, 3 months at a time, and exporters were having to take fresh product and freeze it. They were having to pull it out of export markets and divert it back into the domestic market. But the biggest issue that caused for us is that we couldn't supply consistent beef and pork to our Asian countries, our biggest buyers of U.S. beef and pork. And as a function of that, there was a lot of retailers who started removing U.S. beef and pork from the retail shelf or taking up that space with Australian or Brazilian product, whatever it may be. And so it's, again, a matter of market displacement. And so we're starting to see whether we're going to be able to get back that share that we lost over those few months where we couldn't provide a consistent supply. And ultimately, I've mentioned a lot of countries here, but we have stiff competition. If you look at all these advertisements up here from Australia, from Uruguay, from Canada, from Brazil, they know that we can't compete. They can't compete with us in terms of quality. We have a grain-fed product. It's superior in taste, tenderness, all of those attributes to what they're providing. But you can see kind of a consistency on their marketing activities overseas. Traceability from nature. They play up the grass-fed as being more natural than what we have. And so this is kind of some of the headwinds we face with our competition. So just to wrap up, overall in the year of the sheep, the Lunar New Year in China is the year of the sheep or the year of the ram. So 2015 in the year of the sheep for beef, we're going to expect that the limited global supplies are going to help maintain those historically high prices, both for the U.S. and for many of our competitors. But for the U.S., product is going to continue to flow to those who are willing and able to pay for it because we have a differentiated, extremely high-quality product that has a tremendous amount of appeal in the global market. And China is going to remain a huge variable that if we were to get access to that market could really change the way we are marketing our product and the markets that we're sending it to. For pork, again, record hog production is going to drive down domestic prices, but it's going to improve our competitiveness with the EU in the global market. And until the EU resolves something with Russia, they're going to continue to divert that pork into markets that the U.S. has a major presence in. And so we can expect strong competition from the EU in the coming year. And our non-access to Russia and our limited opportunity in China is only going to exacerbate us having to find markets for this, like I said, the big wall of pork that's coming at us in 2015. The West Coast ports, we'll see how that plays out. Country of origin labeling, we could probably go into a whole nother presentation on that. But if the cool rule is upheld, we can expect retaliation from the Canadians and from the Mexicans. And what effect is that going to have on two of our biggest markets for U.S. beef and pork if that's upheld? But ultimately, the U.S. is the leader in grain-fed beef production. We're actually the low-cost producer of grain-fed production. And those unique aspects of beef and pork are going to continue to prop up our export success. And I thought it was interesting listening this morning to talk about sustainability and how that relates to production capacity and efficiency. And in worldwide, when you talk about our efficiency and our production capacity, that's really a positive in the eyes of many of our international buyers. They see that as maybe as we as producers look at it from a sustainability standpoint, that we are providing the red meat that's going to feed the world. And as these other issues such as animal health and animal welfare, food safety, and the actual concept of sustainability become more well known by our international markets, I think that's an attribute that we need to advertise and we need to promote to our international consumers, because they look at all of those and they look at the U.S. as a leader in those categories, and I think that we can continue to promote that to our international counterparts.